It was one of the darkest days for the world's oldest democracy. Trump supporters went on a rampage and laid siege to Capitol Hill, where the U.S. Congress was in process of certifying Joe Biden's election as the 46th president of the United States of America. The mob scaled the walls of the Capitol, broke through the barricades, smashed glasses, and even entered the office of Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Unprecedented scenes that America and the world will never forget.
A ragtag revolt under a billionaire's branding. People power, ugly and unleashed. The marauding mob was unstoppable. Too much for brittle police ranks to hold the line. Medieval methods helped too. And those who didn't rush the doors in their attack on the home of American democracy treated it like a true home invasion. Breaking and entering, then rampaging through its hallways. This was their Occupy Washington moment. Dozens, some of them illegally armed, pushed deeper into hallowed chambers. The Capitol's own police, cowed by the invaders, were the last line of defence, and that line crumpled and collapsed too. Total disorder in the House.
They want us down.
Stunned politicians were now captive to the chaos.
We were just told that there has been tear gas in the rotunda, and we're being instructed to each of us get gas masks that are under our seats.
The point of their work, to certify the next US president, was quickly abandoned in a capitulation to the horde on their floor and in their seats. They eventually shut down, locked down and left.
Right now, I am sheltered in place in my office because we have protesters who have stormed the Capitol. Mr. President, you have got to stop this.
Unchallenged and free to roam, the iconoclasts made themselves at home, leaving a chilling note in the office of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. America's political leadership was in hiding. The president-elect, hundreds of kilometres away in Delaware, took it upon himself to lead.
It's chaos. It borders on sedition. And it must end now.
13 days ahead of assuming any actual power, Joe Biden pleaded with the current president to use his.
I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
Eventually, Donald Trump did respond with a Twitter video message, but without any condemnation of those who'd rioted in his name.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special.
In time, authorities cleared the Capitol. And in retreat, the president's supporters lashed the news media. There was nothing fake about their menaces and nothing to diminish the carnage they wrought. One woman was shot dead in a confrontation with police.
A number of police and Secret Service were saying, get back, get down, get out of the way. She didn't heed the call, and as we kind of raced up to grab people and pull them back, they shot her in the neck.
Dozens were arrested by nightfall when security agencies retook the Capitol and flushed a short-lived insurgency well clear for blocks around it. This assault on democracy was brutal and bruising. Those who inflicted it have now, for the most part, melted away. But the stain they've left in Washington, D.C. may well be an enduring one. It has brought words of unity and healing by some within Congress, surely unheard and certainly not believed by the angry mob here today.
The Senate will come to order.
Among the many losses and the damage to be tallied, this is an almost tragic one.
We condemn the violence that took place here in the strongest possible terms.
A loyal Vice President in Mike Pence has been publicly spurned by Donald Trump simply because he wouldn't do the president's bidding and flip votes to him against the will of the people.
This mob was in good part President Trump's doing, incited by his words, his lies.
Now we're going to finish exactly what we started. The American people deserve nothing less.
The will of the people is the beacon in this seat of American power. It flickers still, but dimly tonight.
For a quick live update, I want to go across to Cindy Sin, from Washington, D.C., joining us live on the Newstrack. Cindy, can you give viewers who've been shocked by the scenes that we've seen on Capitol Hill a sense of what's happening at this moment? Have things now been brought completely under control? We see finally President Trump has conceded defeat?
Yes, we are waking up here in Washington to a stunning that we were under curfew overnight. Residents just trying to sort of reeling from what happened and many feeling like captives in their own homes overnight. I myself worked in that beautiful U.S. Capitol building for 7 years and was just horrified, as so many others, to see mob hordes going through. And there's more questions really than answers today. The situation, to answer your question, is under control. As your report said, in the early hours of the morning, Congress did the job that they started to do, and they certified Joseph Biden as the next president of the United States. So lawmakers did their work and then left the Capitol, and there's probably still some cleanup going on there in the Capitol, both physically and otherwise.
Hussein, for joining us from Washington this morning, thank you very much. While Donald Trump has said that there will be an orderly transition of power on the 20th of January, there is a call for his impeachment again. There's been talk about invoking the 25th Amendment, which will see Vice President Pence take over for the next few days and would ensure that Trump is removed just before his tenure ends, raising the question, what happens to Donald Trump now?
After the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. was overrun by Donald Trump's supporters, clamor for his removal is getting louder. Less than a week left for President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration, many lawmakers want Trump to leave office, especially after Trump's address triggered the mob.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country.
But can Donald Trump be impeached again? Lawmakers are calling to invoke the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Introduced in 1965, the 25th Amendment was ratified by the states 2 years later. It lays down rules on how the U.S. President and Vice President might be succeeded or replaced. It determines the capacity of a president. According to the clause, the Vice President becomes the acting president if the incumbent office holder is unable to discharge his or her duties. A president can be removed if the vice president and majority members of the cabinet are of the opinion that he is no longer able to function. If Trump is unable to prove his capability, Vice President Mike Pence will become the acting president for the remaining days. For all this to happen, Pence has to play ball. But will he?
January 6th will be remembered as one of the biggest blots in contemporary American political history. America is waking up to two options of either impeaching Trump or invoking the 25th Amendment and ousting him. Either way, President Trump will make history by becoming the first president to be impeached twice over, or for that matter, a president to be removed without a medical emergency. But this could mean hierarchy for the Republican Party if the cabinet and Vice President Mike Pence get together and oust President Trump just 14 days before Joe Biden takes over. In New Delhi, Geeta Mohan for India Today.
Now, these are the kind of scenes that you may expect in Somalia, in Mosul in Iraq, or Kabul in Afghanistan. The last place you'll expect an insurrection or a riot of this kind is in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill. It's before this inconceivable. What does this rioting mean for America's standing in the global community? Does this hasten America's decline and speed up China's rise? Will America be able to recover from the chaos unleashed by Donald Trump? Joining me on the Newstrack, I want to welcome first and foremost Navteej Sarna. He's been India's ambassador to the United States between 2016 and 18. Those are the first 2 years of the Donald Trump administration, has worked closely with President Trump and his government. We have Professor Sumit Ganguly, a distinguished professor of political science. He joins us from the Indiana University in Bloomington. We've got Sadanand Dhume. He's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute from Washington, D.C. Sadanand has been trolled extensively for putting out several weeks ago a post on Twitter which spoke of how something like this would never happen, and that is unfortunately exactly what's going to happen, which is clearly beyond the imagination of those who are living in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. We've got Dr. Rick Mehta. Last year he became the first Indian American to win the Republican primary for the Senate seat from the U.S. state of New Jersey. He's a biotech entrepreneur and healthcare policy expert. I want to go across to Sadanand first because, you know, you've really got a bit of pasting on social media for suggesting that this would never happen, and that is exactly what we saw play out, an insurrection, a riot of a kind that was unimaginable in Washington. It's still too early, we're still in the moment, but what, according to you, is the larger message this is sent about America's present state to the rest of the world?
Look, Rahul, thank you for having me on your show. Getting a pasting on Twitter is perfectly fair. I hold no grudge against the people who decided to sort of pull up this tweet of mine from early November. The truth is that back in November, I was based my prediction on an orderly transfer of power on more than 200 years of American history. This was clearly unimaginable to me, and it was very unimaginable, I would argue, to most people, not just in the United States, but all over the world. This country has always been marked by a peaceful transfer of power, maybe not counting the Civil War years, but in general, going back right to the founding. These are, they're just fundamental aspects of American democracy. This obviously has been marred by the unfortunate events that we saw yesterday. But I would like to sort of point out to your viewers that there is one very big difference between Somalia and some of these other countries that you mentioned, which is that, yes, the mob did invade, and no one should minimize that. But within a few hours, the normal business of the Congress did resume, and Joe Biden was certified as President of the United States, and he will be sworn in on January 20th. So this is the sort of chaotic thing one does not associate with America, but it's not as though the chaos in the end has prevailed over order.
Ambassador Sarna, it's almost as if you've got one very big part of America living in a bubble, not seeing the real news. They're convinced that Donald Trump hasn't lost the election, that this election is being stolen by the fake news media and by the left-leaning Democrats. And they've gone and stormed Capitol Hill, almost the same as storming the Indian Parliament. Will America, in your view, ever be able to recover from the chaos unleashed by Trump and his supporters?
Well, honestly, Rahul, I think America is at a crossroads. I think the people who were there are a microcosm of a large part of the American population who actually believes in Donald Trump. Amongst the Republicans, he still has a 90% rating, which is quite honestly, quite surprising. George W. Bush had 65% left by the time he was leaving office. And what has happened today has not happened on its own. It's a culmination of what we have seen for 4 years. And I agree that maybe in November it was not obvious that this would happen, but possibly in the last week, it became increasingly obvious that something like this was on the cards. The way Trump kept on putting the election in doubt and inciting people, gathering people, planning a big thing. He tweeted, come on January 6th, it's going to be wild. What else do you need? So I think the fact is that there is an alternate reality which has been created by Donald Trump, using fake news, using very influential networks. Right from the get-go, he had Steve Bannon in there as his closest advisor, and you know what that means. So, and this alternate reality that has been created actually believes that this election has been stolen. So, if the US is to recoup its position, it will depend to a large amount on how the Republican Party repairs from this moment. Do they still carry on hitching their star like so many of them did till virtually the last minute, and Ted Cruz did even now, to Donald Trump in the hope of electoral prospects? Or will they realize that a line has been crossed, that the American population will not back them unless they begin to repair and become the party of the Constitution, become the party of order that they are supposed to be?
Embarrassed by these Trump supporters and the manner in which they try to storm Capitol. We're now seeing in the Senate some of the Republican senators cut their ties with Donald Trump, but many of them left it till too late. And many in the Republican Party are being blamed for having been part of this chaos.
Well, let's parse this through. First of all, one of the things that we do so poorly is that we make sweeping assumptions about everyone. Yesterday, there were more than 2.5 million people. Less than 200 of them were responsible for swarming the Capitol building and inciting violence. There is no place for violence in our country. And I'd like to think that America has become the greatest democracy that the world history has ever seen. Okay, so we can't let less than 0.01% of people, many who have been recognized as Antifa violent inciters. We saw that over the summer. We can't ignore the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa violence that has been happening for months in our country, and then attribute it to groups of people. The other thing we don't do well is listen. We don't listen to the voices of the people, 2 million people peacefully protesting because they feel like they've been disenfranchised. This isn't just more than stealing the election. This is assuring that we have free and fair elections. And I agree, we have to come together as a country, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, and work to ensure that any future election is secured and that we avoid this kind of issues related to fraud.
I didn't hear an apology or a condemnation as a representative of the Republican Party for the chaos that these Trump supporters inflicted on Capitol Hill and the message this sends about the state of democracies worldwide.
We condemn everybody who's involved with inciting violence. We got to wait to see what justice brings to who was involved. But attributing that to all 2 million people, many of them who I know that were there to peacefully protest of what they felt was a disenfranchisement of their constitutional right to vote, is also not the right answer.
Professor Sumit Ganguly, we saw also the police virtually allowing them in places, because you can't just, for example, storm the Indian Parliament and not have the security push you back. You had lax security being allowed to come in, and now you're hearing from the likes of Rick Mehta. He's saying that there are lots of people, only a few got violent. The others were sending a strong message that they don't like the manner in which the election results have been counted.
To begin with, there is not a scintilla of evidence that there was anything fraudulent or that there was any element of malfeasance in this election. This is simply a fabrication that has been promoted by President Trump and his closest allies, and they have not been able to produce a shred of evidence that would suggest that this election was compromised in any fashion. I want to be abundantly clear on this point. Secondly, it is also clear that the Capitol Hill police were abjectly unprepared for the onslaught, even though there was ample evidence of people gathering to wreak havoc on the Capitol Hill grounds. This was not only a failure of intelligence on their part, but this was a failure of preparation. And let me suggest a thought experiment for a second. Imagine for a moment if these people had been black or brown, they would have been mowed down by the police and the National Guard, as has been the treatment of the Black Lives Matter movement earlier this summer that was referred to just earlier by the previous speaker. The notion that somehow or other that BLM posed a threat to the United States and to all is just laughable.
Can I just hold you there and show our viewers this report on precisely the point that you're making, comparing last year's Black Lives Matter protests and the manner in which the law enforcement agencies dealt with those protesters with what happened at Capitol Hill on Thursday morning. Take a look.
This was Capitol Hill during Black Lives Matter demonstrations last year. The protests were against the police killings of unarmed black men and women sparked by the death of George Floyd. Contrast this to what happened on Thursday when Trump supporters laid siege to the Capitol. Last year, the Capitol Police was on the steps of the hill, standing guard, strong and stoic.
I'm tired of my black men and my black women being
As thousands of people of color and allies took to the streets last year to peacefully protest police brutality, law enforcement often clashed with demonstrators, deploying tear gas and rubber bullets, bruising faces and bodies. Today they proved to be ineffective and completely unprepared. As thousands of Trump supporters, mostly white, marched to the Capitol, breaking into the building, forcing lawmakers to take shelter. The crowds of law enforcement were notably absent. And while hundreds of Black Lives Matter protesters were arrested last year, several videos showed officials slowly escorting Trump supporters out of the building. Trump, who had characterized Black Lives Matter protesters as thugs, hailed the rioters on Twitter as great patriots who have been unfairly treated for so long. Several activists and commentators have highlighted the glaring discrepancies. Black Lives Matter Global Network called the law enforcement response to Thursday's riot hypocritical. The group in a statement said, "Make no mistake, if the protesters were black, we would have been tear-gassed, battered, and perhaps shot." Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., also tweeted, "If these were Black Lives Matter storming the Capitol, tanks would have been in the city by now." She wrote, "The response tells the story of our nation's racist history and present. It also tells the story of a deeply divided America." Bureau Report, India Today.
Professor Ganguly, when the Black Lives Matter protesters were out trying to make a point, they were met with assault rifles, tear gas shells, shields, battle helmets, and now you've got these double standards playing themselves out. it's almost as if the law and the law enforcers are not acting equally. Why do you think the law enforcement was so soft on these protesters who stormed Capitol Hill?
Because, bluntly stated, there is a streak of racism that runs right through the spine of American society. We cannot elide over this tragic fact. And this has been brought to the fore by the demonstrations that have taken place over the course of the past year. And of course, it has to also be attributed to the Trump Justice Department, which has had completely differential standards for black people and for white protesters. White protesters are dismissed as being as mentally unstable, as being marginal, as being fringe groups, but black protesters are depicted as terrorists and potential threats to the republic. There is a blatant double standard, and Trump has legitimized this double standard, and William Barr, his recently resigned Attorney General, in large part presided over this ever since he was in office.
Ambassador Sarna, what are the larger geopolitical consequences? You very naturally have, Xi Jinping in Beijing rubbing his hands in glee, smiling and laughing, because this is not just a repudiation of Donald Trump, but of the American order, of the American way of life, of America's values which they like to export. Now China can turn around and say that look at how we run our system in an authoritarian fashion. We seem to be doing better than a liberal democracy. Will these Trump years and what we've seen at Capitol Hill hasten China's rise and America's decline?
I think this moment of glee will pass soon enough. If Donald Trump wanted to make the wicket stickier for Joe Biden, he has succeeded. So Biden will have to work harder. The US will have to recover its credibility first by demonstrating strength at home, both in the control of the pandemic, as well as the control of the economy, as well as the control over the process of social healing. I don't think they are in the game of trying to convert China's values. I think China and Russia will be dealt with by the United States on the given paradigms that they have been dealt with for so many years. There will be differences in terms of how Biden deals with China and how Trump was dealing with China. Clearly, Biden will believe in more engagement, more cooperation, and yes, competition, but perhaps not blunt confrontation. So I think the short answer is that the US will have to recover its credibility, both at home and abroad. And I think Biden's way of doing it will be through engagement with allies, engagement with partners, engagement with international organizations. But yes, he's probably been taken down, put 10 points behind in his effort, which would in any case have been tough.
No. One is the challenges that face Joe Biden at this moment, Sadanand Dhume. The other is the message this is sent to countries across the world. Look at, for example, how China dealt with COVID-19, how the United States is dealing with COVID-19 at this moment, how this transition is taking place from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. All of it suggesting that there is something now seriously wrong with America, that this is no longer the United States that the world once dealt with, that this is a country now in terminal decline.
Look, Rahul, I think that any fair-minded person would have to concede that the events of yesterday were not the best advertisement for democracy. And it's certainly true that authoritarians around the world and people around the world who have sympathy for these authoritarian systems are going to use this to point to the superiority of an authoritarian system over a democracy. But I don't think any of us who support democracy have ever claimed that democracy is perfectly clear and clean and never messy. Of course, democracy is messy. I think what happened yesterday was excessive. But the general chaotic, contentious nature of democracy, which is rooted in debate and discussion, has always been a phenomenon. We've always seen that as part of US life, but certainly not been a phenomenon in China. And I would argue that for all its problems, in the end, and we have a long history that shows this, in the end, a democratic system has deeper shock absorbers and is able to kind of contain disagreements that always exist in any society, particularly in a diverse society, far more effectively than this top-down Chinese model that may look attractive and certainly is effective over periods of time, perhaps over a few years, in this case over the past 4 decades, since around 1980 or so. But I would certainly not bet in the long term on an authoritarian top-down model being providing more stability than a democratic model.
Sumit Ganguly, the same question to you. Do you think this hastens America's decline? What's the message it sends to China?
I don't, despite the disarray that currently characterizes American politics, I don't think I would make any long-term inferences about American decline. I think President Biden will restore many of the relationships that Trump had significantly frayed over the last 4 years, that he will provide suitable leadership both at home and abroad. He will restore a degree of comity to American life. And while the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and other authoritarian states are feeling gleeful at the moment, I think their glee will be short-lived.
Social media platforms have blocked President Trump from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. This crackdown becomes the latest addition to Trump's list of infamy, making him the first world leader to have been blocked out on social media.
Chaos in the capital of United States. A pro-Trump mob laying siege to the supreme US seat of power for hours. And President Donald Trump fanning the flames of unrest online, leading to social media giants to firmly put their foot down. Twitter, in an unprecedented move, removed 3 of US President's tweets which incited violence and made baseless claims on electoral fraud. Before this, Twitter has flagged several tweets of Trump but had never removed them. Twitter also locked Trump's account for 12 hours and threatened permanent suspension. Facebook followed suit, blocking Trump's account for 24 hours, citing 2 policy violations. It also removed Trump's controversial video urging his supporters who stormed the Capitol to go home while claiming poll fraud.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace.
Facebook-owned Instagram also imposed a 24-hour ban on Trump. YouTube also removed a video by Trump from its platform. The outgoing US president, who could face impeachment, stands accused of using social media to stage an unofficial coup. Bureau Report, India Today.
I'm now joined on the show by Helen Lee Bougis, expert in social media, fake news, has been studying how Donald Trump has been using social media to try and whip up this hysteria, build the specter of fake news, and use that fake news on social media to engineer a real-life insurrection. Can you share, Helen, your analysis so far on the extent to which fake news was responsible for the chaos that we saw on Capitol Hill?
I think fake news is a real issue actually for both elections, not just this current election. But if you remember, the term fake news was coined actually 4 years ago with the misinformation that came out of Macedonia talking about the Pope actually being a supporter of Trump in the election. The real issue now is not just misinformation, but disinformation, and disinformation being about hoaxes and actual outright deliberate lies rather than just misconceived notions. The real challenge, as you indicated in the reporting, is the role that true social media plays into this creation of a monster situation where people have extreme views. And let me elaborate. Today in the US, over 90% of the information that people gather, unfortunately, is not through journals like yourselves, but actually via directly the social media. Now, as we all know, social media, their business model is actually to have more eyeballs and for people to stay online longer. And so what this means is their algorithm is structured to actually prey on people's emotions and actually continue to only see their point of view and not opposing points of view. And so when we start preying on people's emotions, the capacity of people to take a step back and say, is this logical? Have I checked the source of where this information is coming from? Does this even make sense? A lot of that becomes diminished because people are too emotional. It's hard to do critical thinking when you're too emotional.
So that's the problem. But have you been thinking also about the possible fix? Is there a solution which we should be working on immediately to try and take the world out of this bubble of alternate reality?
I think, unfortunately, governments aren't going to be the first people who are going to take action. Clearly, the social media companies are not going to censor themselves. You pointed out about Twitter, because of so much backlash, they took Trump offline for a couple of hours. But since the election, it's been a bit random of what they were taking off or on. And that's actually been the biggest critique about Twitter, because there isn't transparency of the algorithm of what they post or what they censor, let alone giving more indication of what sources are, if there are sponsored sites that are on that are being tweeted and clickbaited. So it's not so much whether or not they fact check, it's actually this total this lack of transparency for the public to actually know how these sites are designated. So fundamentally, unfortunately, it's a longer term solution. But what we need to do is for the people themselves to be armed better with media literacy and actually take digital detoxes, spend, I have friends who deliberately will take off social media so that they force themselves to directly read journals like yourselves, rather than going via the very narrow channel and tunnel to have tunnel vision via social media.
This is a big problem. I'm not certain there are any easy or immediate solutions, but it's important to talk about this. And Helen, I appreciate you taking out time and joining us on the Newstrack. The world reacted in shock as rioters took over the US Congress. From Prime Minister Modi to the French president, leaders condemned the violence but called for faith in America's democracy.
Hundreds of rioters marching towards the center of world's oldest democracy. A standoff at gunpoint inside the chambers of the US Senate. The world watched in shock and disbelief as rioters attacked the United States Congress. Early hours of Thursday saw Prime Minister Modi tweeting he was distressed to see the riots and violence in Washington, D.C. First reaction came from Canada's PM, Justin Trudeau. He said Canadians were saddened by the attack on American democracy. The rest of the world soon followed. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she was angry and sad after seeing the act of anarchy.
It's a scene that feels familiar. However, the reactions of some people in the US, including media, were portrayed differently.
Emmanuel Macron expressed faith in the United States democracy.
What happened today in Washington, D.C. is not America, definitely. We believe in the strength of our democracies. We believe in the strength of American democracy.
Those comments.
Australia urged a peaceful transfer of power. China, meanwhile, compared the riots to the Hong Kong protests. Its foreign ministry spokeswoman, Hua Chunying, said reactions of the media were starkly different then.
We hope that the American people could enjoy peace, stability and security as soon as possible.
American democracy survived the riots by a hair's breadth last night. Now Joe Biden faces a monumental task of uniting a deeply divided nation. Bureau Report, India Today.
Hi everyone, Preeti Chaudhary here. Hope you like this video. For latest news and analysis, like and subscribe to the India Today YouTube channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated. Thank you for watching.